So here we go with the first plenary session, debt-free sovereign money financing for UBI, and I'm very happy to have here Jeff Crocker, Aida Garcia Lazaro, and Alex Howlett from the FRIBIS team, and I would kindly ask you to introduce yourself and about what your session will be. We will have like 3 time slots, 30 minutes per presentation, which is like 20-minute presentation. And then we have a 10-minute slot for questions. And I would kindly ask our audience to post the questions in the YouTube chat just on your right side. This is right, I think. Jeff?
I'm Jeff Crocker. I'm a researcher in basic income and sovereign money. I have a book out of the same title, which has just come out in Korean, actually, and work together with Ida and other colleagues in research of it. Ida.
Me? Okay, I'm Aida Garcia Lazaro. I'm working at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath in the economics of basic income. And yeah, that's it.
Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I've been studying basic income for about 10 years now, and I'm affiliated with Project Gresham, and I've been doing a little bit of collaboration or back and forth with some of the FRIBIS groups, so I'm excited about this.
Thanks very much, Alex. Here we go. Can you see this screen? Somebody say yes.
Yes.
Good, thanks. So this is the kickoff session introducing the concept of basic income funded by debt-free sovereign money and claiming that this is actually a strategic necessity for basic income. So here quickly to rehearse the standard cases that we all are aware of for basic income. Basic income contributes to social justice because it addresses inequality and precarity, and it acknowledges the shared inheritance we have in the infrastructure and technology in this world. It's the best welfare system because it's less intrusive, it's lower cost, higher uptake than means-tested benefits, although it does compete, of course, with means-tested and targeted benefits in the shared target of social justice. And I note that the World Bank report of last year found targeted benefits were 60% more effective than UBI in poverty reduction. It's a challenge. But also, a UBI has no unemployment and poverty traps compared to targeted welfare benefits. It has an important role, which I'll be exploring in this presentation, in macroeconomic demand, because the claim is that technology, automation and technology are sucking income out of the economy and loading the economy with debt at the same time, leading us to a huge need to get income to people and to get debt out of the economy. UBI has a strong ecological argument because it breaks the link between adequacy of household income and yet more employment, yet more output, yet more resource depletion and pollution. And finally, but by no means least importantly, it enables human flourishing because it enables choice in lifestyle. Now, I've whizzed through those points because they're all set out on the website, The Case for Basic Income at ubi.org. Funding basic income then becomes the issue that's on most people's minds, is the big challenge to basic income, and it's the focus of my presentation, because UBI is said to be either too small to be meaningful or too large to be affordable. And you'll see that mantra, as it were, repeated in many analytical papers on UBI, leading to its virtual dismissal by a number of critics. So getting the funding challenge is extremely important. Here are some of the funding options that are typically suggested for basic income. The first is, in a sense, isn't much of a funding option because revenue neutral schemes which are proposed rely on higher taxation and the replacement of other benefits to fund basic income to end up, roughly speaking, revenue neutral. The comment I'd make on that is that, okay, this does achieve unconditionality and less intrusion, less humiliation of means-tested benefits, which is important, but it's an open question as to whether it necessarily leads to less poverty. Wealth tax is often proposed. My comment there is that it's actually really difficult to implement a wealth tax other than as an inheritance tax, because the range of assets people hold in their wealth is really very widespread. So although there's 12 trillion pounds of assets held in the UK, of course, a lot of that is people's housing. And the question is how you then introduce yet a further property tax on top of the local council taxes that we currently have. But people may hold their assets as in cash, which is easy to tax, or as various other assets like company shares or actual company factories or whatever or yachts or whatever it may be. So that becomes pretty difficult to manage. Land tax is often proposed. And my comment there is that the most profitable companies in the internet age are the FANG companies, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google companies who make huge profits using very little land. So they would contribute very little land tax despite their massive earnings. Eco taxes are advanced, but my own position is that we should be trying to eliminate pollution, not using it as a source of revenue. And sovereign fund investment, as in Norway, is put forward, but it requires a mixture of the above, which is why I want to focus on the concept of sovereign money creation, which is a heterodox paradigm change. 4 reasons why basic income, in my view, needs debt-free sovereign money. By debt-free sovereign money, I simply mean money that is created either by a government or the central bank and released into the economy without being counted towards a national debt. It may sound radical, it may sound like moonshine, but I hope by the end of the presentation you'll think otherwise. First of all, it's the only way to deliver adequate basic income at an affordable cost. The only way that we can break this challenge that UBI is either too small to be meaningful or too large to be affordable. Secondly, it is a consistent argument for debt-free sovereign money, as it is for basic income. And in the thought experiment of a totally automated economy, where you could plug a machine into the world to produce all the goods and services we needed, the only way to distribute the goods and services would be by voucher. The vouchers represent debt-free sovereign money, and they also represent basic income. So the argument is that if a totally automated economy requires basic income funded by debt-free sovereign money, then a partially automated economy presents a partial reason for a partial UBI and debt-free sovereign money. And thirdly, the pilot of UBI and debt-free sovereign money has been delivered for us as a result of the dreadful COVID experience. Because in the UK, for example, we've paid £24,000 a year to 3 million people at a cost of £72 billion. And that was funded as part of the Bank of England, the central bank's purchase of 875 billion of government debt, which I argue, since the government owns the Bank of England, represents debt-free sovereign money. And that has not led to hyperinflation, and it's not led to devaluation. So it links the requirements that we face in our present dysfunctional economy to get income to people and to get debt out of the economy. We're all aware of these dysfunctionalities in our present economic paradigm. We hit crisis in 2007 and may do again. There's pervasive debt through the system, continuous austerity policy hitting the poor, extensive poverty, including in-work poverty, low-paid jobs, increased inequality, massively increased inequality, even in work, ecological damage, which requires a radical rethink and a re-engineering of the economic system. And indeed, when you look at that crisis of 2007, the bad guy theory was that bad banks created too much debt and bad governments failed to regulate. And those were the correctives of tighter bank regulation, quantitative easing, and austerity policy. But since it's not working, we then might ask ourselves, well, what actually did cause this crisis? Was it a behavioral explanation, or actually was it a structural explanation in that technology sucked income out of the economy, which was replaced by debt, consumer debt, household debt, which therefore led to collapse? And here's a picture of the claim I'm making, whereby automation, by its increase in productivity, necessarily, arithmetically, increases output per hour worked and therefore decreases the wage unit per unit of output. And so in that box there, are robots destroying jobs? Well, a little bit, but not pervasively yet, maybe the next phase. But nevertheless, what that technology is doing is first of all, it's having an effect of reducing labour bargaining power, because if less labour is required, less labour power for bargaining is there. But secondly, it's sucking income out of the economy. And we see as a test of that, which I'll show in some diagram in a moment, that aggregate labour income is reducing consistently as a share of GDP and as a share of consumer expenditure. And we all know that we're seeing the bifurcation of employment into high-paid specialty jobs and low-paid bullshit jobs, so-called. And that forces an increase in household debt, and it forces an increase in welfare spend. So we see household debt and government debt both increasing in this paradigm. So here's my thought experiment again, that if you plug a machine into the earth, we will get an automated economy with 100% basic income and 100% debt-free sovereign money. The nuanced argument therefore being that in high-tech economies, some element of unearned or basic income becomes an essential component of demand. Sovereign money becomes essential to fund it. And the empirical evidence I'll show is that earned income has indeed declined against consumer expenditure consistently over 70 years, that huge household debt has acted as a surrogate for the missing basic income, and huge government debt has acted as a surrogate for the missing sovereign money. And there's a graph. So there's a graph that shows for the UK economy over that 70-year period, consumer expenditure initially totally funded by earned income, labour income, then from 1995 onwards, not funded by earned income. So earned income is declining, and there's an increasing structural need for unearned income, and the best form of that is in the form of a basic income to be part of consumer income. And we see the same picture there for the German economy since 1970, consumption and wages being tracked. So I won't go into these graphs in detail, but here we see the swamping of our economies by debt. Debt is everywhere. UK household debt is now, in 2018, was £1.28 trillion, i.e. 61% of GDP. Much of that is in property debt, but it's not all going to buy houses. Some of the debt against housing is indeed to fund consumer expenditure. And we see of the £12 billion increase in the years between 14 and 16, 6 billion of that being in hire purchase and 7 billion of that being in student loans. Debt everywhere in the international economy. So here we see on the left-hand side, the UK debt as a percentage of GDP climbing to currently over 100%. And there on the right-hand side, a comparison between countries where Japan reaches the peak of 234%, which has since increased as its debt as a proportion of GDP. So clearly, I mean, our economies are getting swamped by debt. That debt is then acting as a constraint upon the social expenditure that we actually need and that we actually could afford. Why could we afford it? Because as Keynes famously said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. So if we have a school teacher able to teach, if we have a social worker able to work, then we're able to afford what we're actually able to do. So the problem is that debt constrains expenditure because of what Stephanie Kelton calls the deficit myth. And we see UK household debt at 61% of GDP and national debt at the time, 98% of GDP, a total of 159% of GDP. And of course, that increased through the COVID experience. Household debt and government debt constraining expenditure, hence poverty, including in-work poverty and austerity. Therefore, let's take these first conceptual steps. Firstly, to replace household debt with basic income funded by sovereign money. And secondly, to replace government debt with sovereign money and restore those austerity cuts. It does mean redefining our concept of money. If we're going to take debt out of the system, from the concepts of financial orthodoxy, that money has inherent value from gold reserves or sale of government bonds, which create debt, that money is real, can't be created or destroyed, that government's budgets must balance, and that household and government expenditure become debt financed and therefore limited by debt. So affordability becomes defined by government financial reserves, to a more heterodox theory of sovereign money that claims that money has no inherent value, i.e. there is a magic money tree. And it's pretty clear, particularly with digital money, that we can create money at a keystroke. And therefore it derives its value not from its inherent content, but from its referring to output GDP, to the goods and services that we accept that it can buy as a social convention. So a sovereign state can issue money versus its GDP without, I'll claim, creating debt. Sovereign money, I've tried to show, is necessary in high technology economies, and household and government expenditures can then be funded by that sovereign money. So affordability is defined by real resources and productive potential. And as Keynes said, we can do anything, we can afford anything that we can really do. Now, I won't go into this slide in detail because of time, but there are various definitions of sovereign money by the MMT school, by my colleague Joseph Huber, author of the book Sovereign Money, and my own definition. And there's a summary table at the bottom there that MMT does define money as debt, which I take an alternative view of, does see that debt being balanced by other sectoral surpluses, according to the Wynne-Godley identity, and proposes a zero interest rate, so there's no financing cost. Bank money by Joseph Huber only allows a central bank to create money because commercial banks create too much and they take seigniorage and so on. And my proposal that central bank money does not create debt and that the central bank can continue to work alongside commercial banks. So here's a diagram. Again, I'm not going into detail, it's in the book, showing how money flows in the current economies through wages, taxes, purchases, wages, and so on, and loans, and showing how sovereign money would be superimposed on the present system. The life of bonds. So at the moment, government spending is funded by taxation and by borrowing. We have just seen a huge COVID spending in most countries, where in the UK, the Debt Management Office has sold gilts to insurance companies and pension funds, and those have then been bought in the secondary market by the Bank of England, A, to prop up the price of those gilts so that yields remain low, and B, to create a central bank issued sovereign money. The problem with this process is that it leads to risk-free margins for the intermediaries. So since the central bank isn't allowed to buy in the primary market, only stockbrokers, pension funds, and insurance companies are, and the central bank buys from them, then those first purchasers benefit from huge margins from the Bank of England purchases. And in my view, that's a scandal. And to those of us who want to see the rentier economy addressed and changed, this is a simple change which would have massive effect by taking out those margins and those portfolio valuations out of the financial market by allowing the creation of debt-free sovereign money by the central bank, which I'm claiming we currently have. And that's just a simple graph of the history of recent purchases of by the central bank of government debt. So debt-free sovereign money, which I've called the ultimate liberation theology, it is demonstrably feasible. First of all, cash. Cash is currently issued as debt-free sovereign money. Okay, it's only 3% of the money base, but there's an exemplar of debt-free sovereign money. And currently those central bank holdings of government debt, which are a demonstration of debt-free sovereign money. It's convincingly preferable to debt because it eliminates the myth of national debt being greater than GDP. You know, no economy can pay back 265% of its GDP. It's just a myth and a delusion. It's a wrong identification. And we therefore need to at least get real and say, actually, this isn't debt. It also would eliminate the servicing cost of that debt, which is currently £40 billion a year in the UK, rising to £70 billion. And it crucially enables necessary income to households and necessary income to government welfare spend. It eliminates crisis because you wouldn't get the debt pileup that collapses. It eliminates austerity because it takes away the false constraint of the debt ceilings. And it reduces the financialization of the economy and the huge profit take of the financial sector, returning seigniorage to the state via a seigniorage tax on commercial banks. So I'm basically saying is, what is there not to like, apart from it being extremely radical? We hear, of course, the concern of inflation from UBI, that UBI and sovereign money, but it is not like Weimar and it is not like Zimbabwe, as people constantly tell us, because a hyperinflation requires a breakdown in the real supply sector of the economy, which we do not face. All economies print and create money. The question is how much. The rule of all economic management is that total aggregate demand should not exceed output GDP, and which is well established and implemented in Keynesian monetary demand management, whether that's fiscal through tax or monetary through interest rate. And we just simply have to observe this rule, which all MMT advocates support, that all demand in the economy, including UBI, should be within the GDP boundary. So here's a paradigm shift from two crises. The furlough scheme, as I've pointed out, both in the UK and the USA, delivering such large amounts of income to so many people, has proved that UBI works. Of course, it's not a UBI scheme because it's not you, but it proves that a basic income scheme can be made to work at a substantial level, funded by and within this 875 billion of government bonds bought in the secondary market, i.e. debt-free sovereign money works. And I referenced there an article I recently had published in Prospect magazine. So what are we going to do about this? Well, the FRIBIS group has got a research program going, which we'll be able to report a little bit on in the next paper by Ida, and in future on these projects. So the group, there's a FRIBIS contract now with the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, where we are macroeconomic modelling of UBI funded by debt-free sovereign money within a Wynne-Godley stock flow consistent macroeconomic model of the UK economy. So that will test for a stable equilibrium with macro amounts of UBI and debt-free sovereign money, and would also allow simulation of seeing what effect increased productivity has on requiring higher levels of UBI and debt-free sovereign money. And another contract funded with Cambridge Econometrics, which will apply a multi-sectoral model of the UK economy to look at the macroeconomic implications of current micro-simulation UBI schemes, and to look at sectoral productivity and its linkage through to driving the need for basic income and debt-free sovereign money. And a research project at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, firstly to produce policy papers from the conclusion of current research, which Ida is going to present in the next paper, and then further simulations of productivity, basic income, and debt-free sovereign money scenarios. So there's an extensive program of research work currently in hand to address the real modeling of basic income at substantial levels funded by debt-free sovereign money. So we hopefully get one day to this nirvana where output GDP funded by debt-free sovereign money enables government expenditure and welfare benefits, basic income from consumer expend, without the dysfunctionalities of austerity, poverty, inequality, ecological damage, and crisis. And finally, just a reference to my book, which expands these ideas further. And incidentally, for which I get no royalties, so there's no commercial push here, but it's available to those who might like to take a look further. So Valentin or Ida, I don't know whether we're going to go directly to Ida, who's going to present the results of a 3-year postdoctoral research project at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, looking as to whether a measure of technology has explanatory power in the reduction of the labour share of GDP and therefore into the reduction of household incomes, therefore requiring a basic income element of household income. So Ida, nice to see you. Welcome, and over to you.
Yes, with one short interruption before that, because Jeff, thank you very much for your presentation. We have one question from the YouTube chat.
Okay.
Jeff, you can also read it in the Zoom chat. It's from Otto Leto, and it's saying that debt-free sovereign money is the only way to be able to afford adequate UBI for all is surprising. After all, countries can already afford universal healthcare, universal pensions, etc., etc. So,
well, we've only afforded these universal healthcare and pensions at the cost of very significant deficits and debt mounting up. So I would redefine both, you see. I would say that universal health, universal pensions, and universal income jointly should be funded by debt-free sovereign money, because otherwise the accumulation of a debt that actually isn't really a debt, doesn't need to be a debt, ends up being an artificial constraint, a mythical constraint, as Kelton would say, on our management of the economy. So I agree with you in one sense that health, pensions, basic income, all should be funded. But I would say that without debt-free sovereign money, we generate these mythical piles of national debt. We have to get income to people, but at the same time, we've got to get debt out of the economy, including getting the debt out of the economy that we spent on health and pensions by simply redefining it as no longer debt, because it's actually not.
okay, thank you very much. I asked for follow-up questions, or if there are any other questions regarding the presentation. Otherwise, I would kindly give the word to Aida. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. I think that's, you can see my screen now,
Yep.
right? Okay, thank you very much. As Jeff Crocker well said, this is a research that is being done as part of the Economics of Basic Income project at the University of Bath that is kindly sponsored by Jeff Crocker. So this is work that I developed over these years with Nick Pearce. And I'm gonna try to squeeze 2 papers that I have on the technology and talk a little bit about both of them. So in both cases, the objective is explain the declining labor share in advanced economies, particularly because, as Jeff Crocker has mentioned, when the labor share declines, that means less income for households. So usually what the economists do is that they divide the income between 2 factors, broadly speaking, capital and labor. So the part that belongs to worker is the labor share, and that is converted as a share of GDP. So you can observe in this left graph how the labor share has declined in the OECD countries after the 1980s, and you can see the steep negative slope in here. But someone might say, well, no, that's driven by the US economy. Well, in this case, we have the European countries. Regardless of the definition that we use, we observe a very similar negative trend. Except from the period of the global financial crisis, that by construction, because the labor share is the labor compensation over the GDP, whenever the GDP fails, then we observe a jump in the labor share, and that's why we have this jump in here. But overall, the trend is negative, okay? So, and why is this important? Well, once we know that the the share of the income that belongs to workers is lower in these economies, then we wonder what happened in terms of distribution among the income of those workers. And that is what we measure when we analyze inequality, income inequality, right? And the usual indicator, or an easy one, is the Gini coefficient. So the Gini is between 0 and 100, and the higher values means that the societies are more unequal. So whenever we draw a correlation between the Gini coefficient and the labor share, what we observe is that societies with which are more unequal are also the ones with lower labor share, and societies with a larger labor share are usually presenting lower income inequality. So that's another reason that we think that the labor share is a relevant indicator when we want to analyze what happened with the income of workers' households. Right? So there are potential explanations around the literature of why the decline in labor share is decreasing. And we have a couple that we find that are relevant for our story. One is the globalization, which basically implies trade liberalization and financial liberalization or integration. And those two basic, as we observe from the literature, have got significant evidence that these two events decline the labor share. And why is that? Well, basically because when countries open the economies to a global market, the competition was that strong that made firms more competitive to survive, and the ones that were less competitive, they die. And by competitiveness, we mean to have a lower cost, and that includes labor. So basically, globalization and financial integration reduce the cost of labor, wages, and deteriorate the bargaining power of workers through this channel, because workers in the UK now needed to compete with workers in China, in Latin America, or in any other part of the world. Right? So this is a relevant explanation for the labor share. Market concentration is another. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I would like to focus on the other relevant explanatory factor, that is technological change. And in this, there are existing studies about that they take different angles. I like to focus into at least is the price of capital. So in parallel of the globalization process, we have also observed a decline in the capital prices that has led to firms to be able to afford more capital because the prices were cheaper. So a firm that probably in the 1980s was unable to automate the process, in the 1980s and or in the 2000s, when the capital price declined heavily, then they could do it, right? But increasing capital also means substitution of workers, right? Because there are some tasks that were performed by workers before, but now they could be done by some machine or some type of capital. However, this is not like an easy relationship. It's not that every worker can be replaced by machines of any type of capital, and I'm gonna show in which cases that happen in a little bit more. And the other interesting story is on intangible assets, that this type of capital is a soft capital because it's not related to machines. It's not something that we can observe like a building or and no, it's not like that. It's more like the capital invested or the money invested in improving some processes within the firms, organizational process, or is the investment done in branding, marketing, researching within the firms that have led to the decline of the labor share. And the reason is because the existing money in the country is shared not in two parts, labor and capital. Now it's also shared with these other type of processes that also require some money, right? So I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So that is to say, what I want to show you in here today are two different exercises that we have developed. One is the analysis of the technological change itself on the labor share. And we do it for 20 countries at the aggregate level for the period 1970 to 2019, and for 16 countries for a shorter period because of data availability. And what we do is that we test four variables that we consider are proxies of technological change. And the first one is, as I mentioned, is the capital prices, or the relative prices of investment goods to consumption goods. And that is our indicator of the relative capital prices. Second is the capital intensity, that basically is the stock of capital over the value added in each country or industry. And the ICT capital, same, is a share on the value added. And this fourth one, that is the investment in software and databases. It's an alternative measure of what other people call ICT, but in this case, it only includes the investment in software and databases, okay, as a share of GDP. So these four variables we tested, and we show some results in a moment. And the second part of the other paper that we developed is this one, that we test how much the investment in intangible capital can explain the decline in the labor share. So at the end of the day, it's a type of capital as well. And in here, we consider four a concept of intangibles that have been developed by the latest updates in the national accounts, and I explain in a moment which are those four. So let's go first to the first exercise, that is on the technology. So basically, I'm not going to go in detail to the equation, but what we are testing is how much the labor share can be explained by our main variable, that is technology. And in technology, we have the four indicators of proxy that I just explained, and other variables that we call the controls, because we are aware that there exists evidence that mention about the impact of globalization. So we include trade openness, we include financial integration, and we use them as control variables. And then we also know that labor market institutions are relevant to explain the labor share, and is something that also Jeff Crocker mentioned, right? How the situation in the labor markets makes workers to have less power to bargain the salary. And a final control variable that in the literature exists is the aging. We elaborate this analysis using the alternative estimation methods. I'm going to skip this variable. It's just the information on the data set that you can also check on the papers. So here I'm going to show you some results. In this case, I show you the results for the aggregate labor share, so the total in the economy. And we analyze the impact of capital prices in explaining the labor share. So these points are the values of the estimates that we get, and the intervals are those, the statistical intervals. So whenever this interval is below or above zero, then those are significant. If they cross the zero line, then they are not. So in this case, we observe that the coefficients, regardless of the estimation method, are positive, which means that the decline of the labor share, the decline in the prices of capital declines the labor share, right? Because there is a positive relationship. If the prices for some reason increase, then the labor share would also go up. So that's the story for capital prices. In terms of trade openness and financial integration, we find also negative coefficients. So that means that the increase in openness or trade liberalization declines the labor share. For financial integration, also we find negative effects, although the results are not as robust as for the other two variables. In terms of union density, we have mixed results. In some cases, we get a positive effect. In others, we have a negative one. But that is confirming what other literature says. We have papers that show that the stronger unions lead to larger labor share, but there are other studies that don't find any significant effect, as in this case, for example. So this is something that probably needs to be looked with more detail, and the age dependency ratio is also not very significant. So these three factors are the leading ones to explain the labor share: the capital prices, the trade openness, and the financial integration. That is for the labor share in the aggregate. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the relation between capital and labor is different depending on the skill level of the type of workers. That's why we disaggregate the analysis, and then now we run it using three types of labor share for the three types of workers: the ones in the high skill, the middle skill, and the low skill. So this is comparing what we have in the other plot, but now for the three types of skills. So you can see this light blue is the coefficient for low skill workers, which is also positive. That means the decline in the prices causes the decline in the labor share. But it happens the opposite for high skilled workers. So whenever capital is cheaper, the demand for high skilled workers increase. That means that capital and high skilled workers are somehow complements, but capital and low skilled workers are substitutes, which is something that I think Jeff Crocker mentioned when he talked about the Lucy and the shitty jobs, right? So it's more or less the story that is behind there. So we do the analysis now for the other indicators. We do also for the aggregate labor share, but for time reasons, I'm not showing in there. But the other indicators of technology show us a very similar responses for the low skilled workers, again, and the high skilled workers. The case for the middle skilled workers usually not very definite the answer, but in here increases in capital respect to value added also increases the demand of high skilled workers in this green blue line. And in this olive line, we have the response of low skilled workers when capital increase, and the effect is negative. Okay, and here I just do the comparison for these two databases, but the story is the same, and the results are better for this database. Now, because not all capital is the same, then now we want to test two particular types of capital: the ICT and the capital invested in software and databases. And the most consistent results are good for ICT. So we observe here that high skilled workers, the demand of high skilled workers, so the labor share of high skilled workers increases whenever ICT capital also goes. And it happens the opposite for the low skilled workers. So that is very consistent, historically is very consistent. But in here, I want to highlight what happened with the medium skilled workers. When we focus in ICT, the medium skilled workers have a positive impact. And for capital on software and databases, we only have a significant effect for high skilled workers, which is expected because programmers or people in high tech, they are more demanded whenever the firms invest more in this type of capital. Right? This is one part of the story, that we want to mention. The other is that, well, because we are aware that capital is heterogeneous, we want to also consider other types of capital that are not ICT, that are not buildings or machinery. This is other soft capital. One is the computerized information, that is software and database that I tested before, but also other innovative properties that are all the capital invested in the evaluation or the mineral exploration in the industry that is particularly relevant for the Norway in the oil industry, or in services also. It's relevant for countries that have an economy where the design of processes or the design of new product is relevant, and this capital is related to that. Economic competencies is more in advertising, marketing, all the money designated to that obviously does not go to wages. It goes to a sort of a soft capital or an intangible capital. Also, all the money invested in the organization of the enterprise or the organization of some tasks and processes in the production process, all this money is accounted as capital. And finally, the research and development, that every penny in this research and development task is also counted as capital. In this analysis, what we do is that, again, we run some regressions. We use each of those as explanatory variables, and we use as control what we found in the previous paper. Like ICT capital is relevant to explain, non-ICT capital or total capital, different from ICT, is also relevant, and foreign direct investment, because we have seen an interesting correlation between the countries that have a high investment in intangible capital with the countries that have a significant share of FDI. So that's why we use as a control to exclude that effect. In here, I'm probably just gonna show you so how the share of intangible over value added is across countries and across the types of capital. So in the economic competencies and other innovative properties, software and research development. Probably the fact that I like to highlight is the importance of the Nordic countries, Germany, Denmark, Germany particularly for research and development, Denmark and Finland and Sweden for research development too. And here a final plot on the impacts that we found. Here the exercise is the following. We assume that there is an increase in a 1% increase, let's say, in the other innovative properties, in the capital over the value added, and we wonder what happened with the labor share. So say if there is an increase in the other innovative properties, the labor share declines, and these values are significantly statistically whenever the shaded lines are out of the zero line. So in here we have a negative and significant impact on the labor share. Whenever this type of industries, this type of intangibles increase, the labor share declines. The same happens for economic competency. So it's money invested in branding, in research, in marketing, money invested in design of new products, in also in mineral evaluations, etc. But money in research and development and money in software and databases are not relevant to explain the labor share. I skipped this plot, but basically the story is if we take all the OECD countries and we do the analysis, we find this. In the paper, we have a disaggregation of countries, classifying them by what we call the growth regimes. So basically the mechanism of the policy that countries have followed to promote economic growth. And in that, I think this is a post-Keynesian idea on how we divide advanced economies. And in there we can find an interesting story when we do this split of the sample. And we find that the impact of capital is dependent on the skill type, but also the capital that we use. but in most of the cases, the effect is negative, particularly for Germany, that I assume is relevant in here. The effects in all the cases are negative, and this is one of the countries which presents a larger decline in the labor share among our sample. Finally, I want to mention all this story, why we are doing this analysis. Well, we want to get some grounds to develop a proposal for universal basic income. And usually the question is whether or not the automation is going to be a problem, whether or not there is a displacement of workers. The response is yes, it exists, and it depends on the skills of the workers. It depends on the capital in which firms invest. It depends on the processes that are improved. But overall, the workers that are going to be more affected or are being affected are the low-skilled workers. However, with the new technologies, there is another concern issue, is that AI and robotics and machine learning algorithms are not only displacing low-skilled workers, they also have the power to displace a medium and high skill people. So if we extend this story to the new years, we might have a more severe displacement than the one that we can document with the existing data. And that's why the universal basic income proposal becomes relevant. So I stop here for questions, comments, or anything you want to add.
Thanks, Ida. Great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aida. And I think we don't have questions from YouTube to this. Oh no, there's one. It's from Reinhard Hus. It's nature or ecology does not seem to exist in your models, e.g. agriculture, high use of machinery, pesticides, negative impact on climate and biodiversity, use of labor, positive impact. Please comment.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, thank you. So I think there is a consideration. We are aware that in this type of models, we cannot include the nature, basically for a data limitation, because we would like to do it, but we don't have information. What we can do is that we can generate models that generate the data and then test the case, but we are very aware that there are other factors that are not considered. For example, when we divide the income in factors, we have capital, we have labor, and we have land. But the data on land is not always reliable and is very difficult to operate with. And that's a reason that in most of the official data, they omit it. But it's certainly another factor that we should consider. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Aida. Is there a follow-up question to the last question from YouTube? It's not coming yet, so maybe we just go to Alex and listen to his presentation. Thank you very much, Aida. And afterward, we're going to have a short question round, because there's at least one question regarding the presentation of Jeff already. So Alex, thank you very much for being here.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to get a little bit bigger picture than what some of the previous presenters were talking about. Let me get my presentation up here. Whoops. How do you do this? Oh, here we go. Had to find the present button. There we go. I actually got to go back to the beginning here. Well, that's the last slide. So let me go back on through. Okay. So my talk is called The Natural Rate of Basic Income. So the basic idea here is that any large-scale market-based economy requires a mechanism for distributing money to consumers. Basic income is one such mechanism. In today's economy, we compensate for the absence of basic income with other less efficient, less effective money distribution mechanisms. The purest form of basic income, that is, if we refrain from pairing it with taxes or any other fiscal changes, is new money issued by the government and spent into the economy. This is what Jeff calls debt-free sovereign money. Basic income on its own is a regular, even distribution of newly issued money to everyone. Where the economy's money goes or ends up is also an important question. In equilibrium, we might expect money to flow out at roughly the same rate that it flows in. Basic income only helps us with the economy's inflow of the economy's money. And that's okay. Our economy's current money sources are inefficient and unstable. It's worth replacing them. Today, we stimulate the financial sector to create jobs and push money to consumers through wages. This destabilizes the financial sector and distorts the labor market away from the efficient allocation of labor. Given a particular mix of government spending and taxation policy, there exists exactly one level of basic income that is compatible with a stable financial sector and an efficient labor market. I call this the natural rate of basic income. So an economy is any social system organized for the management and allocation of resources toward the production of goods and services. A market-based economy is one in which people allocate resources voluntarily through mutually beneficial trade. We all know this, right? A government may allocate some resources directly while leaving some other resources for the market to allocate through trade. If the government directly allocated all of the economy's resources, money would have no use. Money is relevant for an economy that allocates at least some of its resources through trade in a large-scale market, or any market, I suppose. Markets use prices to balance supply against demand, and people need a way to pay those prices. Money is what we call whatever the market uses as its pricing and payments standard. In a large-scale market-based economy, people use money to claim the economy's output. Even when the government leaves resources to the market, their economic policy still determines the market's money distribution mechanisms. Basic income is one such mechanism. Basic income is, as we know, an even distribution of money regularly paid to every individual person. Basic income comes with no strings attached. A person need not do anything or to earn or deserve it, right? So economic models kind of out there in the world often assume that consumers come naturally endowed with useful labor they can trade. But in a highly specialized large-scale economy, this is not a general truth. Absent a natural demand for labor that efficiently distributes money to consumers, we use macroeconomic policy to create artificial labor demand. As a direct source of money, basic income allows consumers to spend money without selling labor first. It thereby relieves the government from having to distort the labor market through artificial demand. So most work is not paid. Jobs exist for the remaining work that people will refuse to do without payment. Wages are payments that provide an incentive for people to spend their time differently. Because people must collectively receive some of their money from wages, it is impossible for basic income to be the only source of money for all consumers. We don't have that machine that just plugs into the earth and does everything for us that Jeff was talking about. So in this diagram, Q is the quantity of output, goods and services the economy produces in a period of time. Q star is the current output level, and Q bar is the economy's productive capacity, the maximum possible level of output. R is the level of consumer spending in the economy, and R star is the current consumer spending level. R bar is the maximum level of consumer spending the economy can sustain. Each level of consumer spending maps onto a certain level of economic output. Maximum consumer spending maps onto full economic output. We can partition R star into the portion of consumer spending that comes from wages and the portion that comes from basic income. Conceptually, we can think of any money paid by the market, including income from capital ownership, as a kind of a wage. The lower the basic income, the greater the incentive for people to sell labor for money. At the natural rate of basic income, people are neither under-incentivized nor over-incentivized to sell labor. We use the label leisure to describe how people spend their unpaid time. Labor means paying people to do something different, as I said before. By definition, people prefer their time in leisure activities rather than labor activities, but leisure time need not be unproductive. Shifting people into paid work will therefore not always boost economic output or make society better off. A basic income higher than the natural rate leaves insufficient incentive for people to perform paid labor. A basic income lower than the natural rate pulls people away from more useful unpaid work into less useful paid work. So this diagram just shows a horizontal axis that's a continuum between 100% labor and 100% leisure. The vertical axis is the quantity of output. At either extreme, the economy produces nothing. The labor-leisure balance that achieves maximum output, Q bar, corresponds to the natural rate of basic income. It can be difficult to classify people's time neatly into the binary categories of labor and leisure. Instead, what I like to do is think about everybody as having 24 hours in a day, and then those hours are being allocated to various activities that fall somewhere on the leisure continuum. I find that more insightful than kind of dividing people into jobs and not jobs, or paid work and not. What am I looking at? Labor versus leisure. Did I skip out? Okay, there should be a slide there that says productive investment. So finance exists to fund investment in productive capacity. An efficient financial sector funds the formation of real capital that will contribute to future economic output. Credit never expands for the purpose of influencing demand. This is key, right? Just as pushing money to consumers through jobs distorts the labor market, stimulating the private sector borrowing as an incentive to create those jobs distorts the financial sector. Today's central banks do exactly that. They prop up consumer demand using expansionary monetary policy to boost employment and wages. This arrangement causes an unstable expansion of private credit that leaves the economy susceptible to financial collapse. Basic income provides money directly, bypassing the financial sector and the labor market. The natural rate of basic income prevents both unstable credit conditions and overemployment. Meanwhile, basic income facilitates productive investment by ensuring that consumers have money to activate any new productive capacity that is developed. So, real purchasing power. The natural rate of basic income represents an amount of real purchasing power in the economy, an amount of actual goods and services that people can buy. It derives from the quantity of goods and services that the market has the resources to produce for people. Changes in the price level will not allow us to escape this constraint. In money terms, a higher price level might allow a higher nominal natural rate of basic income, but this nominal increase will not translate into an increase in real purchasing power. The natural rate of basic income works the same at any price level or under inflation or deflation. For present purposes, for the purposes of this talk, we can simplify our analysis by assuming that monetary policy holds the price level fixed at P bar is what I'm calling the fixed price level here. With a fixed general level of consumer prices, the same quantity of money buys the same quantity of output. The level of consumer spending R is the economic output multiplied by the price level P bar. So that's pretty straightforward. In these equations, P bar is the fixed price level that maps every R onto a corresponding Q, and R bar maps onto Q bar. A nominal basic income above the natural rate would cause a period of inflation, of course, until the inflation brings the real purchasing power of the basic income back down to its natural rate, or back down to a level the economy can sustain. A commitment by policymakers to set the rate of basic income to set the real rate of basic income above the natural rate will ultimately fail. Such a commitment represents a promise that consumers will be able to buy more output, more goods and services than the economy can produce. An attempt to meet this commitment will cause us to revise the nominal basic income forever upward. The result is hyperinflation, because it's this unachievable goal, right? A nominal basic income that's below the natural rate causes deflation unless we compensate with other sources of consumer income. In today's world, we have a basic income of zero, obviously. We know that zero is below the natural rate of basic income because we are compensating for it by propping up consumers with other income sources, such as wages and private sector debt. I like to call the cross-section of the economy that exists between consumers and producers the consumer slice of the economy. So within this slice, money flows from consumers to producers to claim a flow of goods and services moving in the opposite direction. The actual production process happens outside the consumer slice. The labor market and the financial sector exist outside the consumer slice, and the basic income itself originates from outside the consumer slice. We're just talking about people going out there buying goods and services, spending money buying goods and services. This is only a small slice of the economy. We can imagine the consumer slice as a pair of pipes kind of carrying equal and opposite flows of money and economic output between consumers, people, right, and producers. The economy produces at full output, Q bar, when the pipes are full and the basic income is at its natural rate. Now, this diagram, sometimes I joke, I like to say this is the most important diagram in basic income, and it's been my Twitter banner actually for the past few years. So this is an aggregate market diagram of the macroeconomy. If you guys aren't following this, you can follow up in the questions. I'll be happy to explain it further. The vertical axis is the price level, and the horizontal axis is economic output. It shows why the level of economic output can settle below the economy's productive capacity and how basic income can address the problem. So I bar is the input price level, the general price level of inputs to the economy's production. P bar is the consumer price level, the general price level of the output of consumer goods and services produced by the economy. Producers pay I bar and they receive P bar. P bar must be above I bar for producers to gain profit. So Q bar represents full economic output on the horizontal axis. It is possible for output to reach equilibrium at a level that falls short of Q bar. At the level of the macroeconomy, it is impossible, of course, for the real price level to adjust. By definition, the real price level is fixed. Because the real price level cannot adjust to clear markets, output quantity must adjust instead. The two aggregate demand curves here each imply a different equilibrium level of economic output. The demand distribution represented by the shallower demand curve causes the economy to produce at full output. Individually, producers seek the combination of prices and quantities that earn them the most profit. But in aggregate, they find equilibrium at the most profitable level of economic output. The diagram here assumes, if you're wondering what's going on, it assumes monopoly pricing, but the story is much the same if we add in competition. So we're looking at kind of like producers will settle at the most profitable combination of prices and quantities. I've shaded the region bounded by the input price level, the output price level, P bar, and the quantity of output, Q. This area represents the profit for producers. Producers want to maximize this area. Each demand curve contains exactly one point that maximizes the area of the shaded rectangle. For the steeper demand curve, the most profitable point is at Q star, which is less than Q bar. Notice that the most profitable PQ point along each demand curve occurs where the curve crosses the price level. This is no accident. We could draw a demand curve whose most profitable point fell at a different price level, but that would imply that the macroeconomy is not in equilibrium at the real price level. And since the real price level is fixed, something needs to adjust somewhere else. If some force keeps the demand curve fixed in real terms, the result is runaway inflation or deflation. The aggregate demand curves must adjust to reestablish equilibrium at some quantity at the current price level, right? All the price levels are equivalent. We gain nothing by pushing aggregate demand out of equilibrium with the price level. When demand settles back into equilibrium, the price level will again cross the aggregate demand curve at the most profitable PQ point. Depending on demand, any level of economic output up to Q bar is achievable at any nominal price level. Or any rate of inflation or deflation or anything like that. The shape of the aggregate demand curve is what ultimately determines the level of economic output. I like to bring up the example, if you have an economy where half of the consumers have money and half of them don't, then the economy will only produce for the people who have the money, assuming you have some mechanism to keep the price level stable. Or no, not even that. If nobody has any money, it's zero. If aggregate demand is steeper, demand is less sensitive to changes in price. That is, it's less elastic, and a lower level of output is more profitable for producers. If demand is shallower, demand is more elastic, and a higher level of output is profitable. The upshot here, of course, is that the absence of deflation or the presence of inflation imply neither that the economy is employing all of its resources, nor that it is producing goods and services at full capacity. The economy achieves full output only if the most profitable point along the aggregate demand curve falls at the intersection of P bar and Q bar. The flatter the distribution of consumer income, the flatter the aggregate demand curve. Basic income on its own, of course, represents a flat distribution of consumer income. So central banks use monetary policy to manage aggregate demand and stabilize the price level. But policymakers are generally not thinking about changing the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Instead, they believe that propping up the price level also helps the economy, close the output gap or bring us closer to full output or even full employment. But as we have seen, even at a fixed price level, any level of equilibrium output, Q star, is possible up to Q bar. So expansionary monetary policy actually works by allowing more credit expansion in the private financial sector. And the distribution of consumer purchasing power generated by this credit expansion is always going to be unevenly skewed. The central bank cannot control this. When monetary policy props up the price level, it steepens the aggregate demand curve. This pushes the equilibrium Q star below Q bar. Financial instability and price level instability are not the same thing. Financial instability occurs when easy credit causes an excessive expansion of private debt. The price level moves when institutions fail to maintain the balance between the flow of consumer spending and the flow of goods and services that they purchase with that money. As a mechanism for distributing money to consumers, basic income is an alternative to easy credit. A higher basic income implies a monetary policy of tighter credit. Basic income at its natural rate flattens out the aggregate demand curve and allows the economy to activate its full productive potential without requiring an excessive expansion of private credit and its concomitant financial instability. So resource availability ultimately constrains economic output. That's always kind of true, right? You're no matter how well you do, you're always going to be limited by resources. But using up or fully employing all available resources in no way implies maximum economic output. Unless we can promise that all resources are always employed to maximum efficiency, using up inputs does not translate to more output. In a world where consumer purchasing power is constrained by wages, it can seem as if it can seem more productive to employ labor than it actually is. This is because economic output is constrained by consumer purchasing power in this case, and an increase in wages eases this constraint and allows the economy to produce more. Higher employment boosts economic output, even if workers are being employed unproductively. So this is the world we live in now, right? Boosting demand, propping up demand, stimulus, that kind of thing. But it's all just a side effect of the fact that we're forcing people to get their money through jobs. If they're getting it through basic income, you wouldn't need to boost employment, boost wages, and boosting, pushing people into make work jobs as an excuse to give them money. It won't actually boost economic output anymore because the basic income is handling it. So basic income as a source of consumer purchasing power allows us to unbundle people's access to economic output from their employment as economic inputs. Basic income allows policymakers to pursue the simultaneous goals of maximum output, minimum employment, and maximum consumer access to the market. So some resources are more efficiently allocated by the government, some are more efficiently allocated by the market. Basic income becomes relevant when the government, for whatever reason, leaves resources for the market to allocate. So resource conservation came up in a couple of the other talks today. So whether it be carbon, materials, or people's time, we can use taxes. We can tax the use of any resource we wish to conserve. These taxes reduce resource use by making it more costly. Fewer available resources result in lower productive capacity and a lower natural rate of basic income. By conserving resources through taxation and allowing the natural rate of basic income to fall, we avoid the negative effects of setting the basic income below its natural rate, which run counter to a goal of resource conservation. So at the local level, it's impossible to introduce basic income as a substitute for expansionary monetary policy. It is also impossible to introduce basic income without making any other changes to fiscal policy. You might even say that at the local level, basic income is always at its natural rate, but it can still be useful to make fiscal trade-offs that push the local natural rate above zero. Fiscal trade-offs are important to consider at the national level too. The problem is, I think, that people often start their examination of basic income by asking about fiscal trade-offs without recognizing that the low-hanging fruit is to bring basic income to its natural rate, leaving all the other fiscal stuff untouched. So there might be taxes you could implement that would increase the level of basic income the economy could handle, and that's fine. Or you want to conserve resources, that's fine too. At the national level, the first step is to replace easy credit with the basic income as the economy's source of money. At the local level, basic income does not substitute for easy credit. As is the case with a national economy, the global economy has a certain productive capacity and therefore a certain level of consumer spending that it can sustain. This implies that there exists a natural rate of basic income for the global economy. There are many possible routes to a global basic income. For example, the United States could pay a basic income to every citizen in the world. This would likely further entrench the dollar's position as the de facto international currency and the Fed's position as the de facto central bank for the global economy. But what matters is that a theoretical natural rate of global basic income prevents global financial markets from investing unproductively and prevents global labor markets from employing resources unproductively. So basic income is a simple solution to a simple problem. To some extent, we can separate the question of how to get people their money most efficiently from the question of the appropriate amount of money to provide. Basic income is an answer to the first question. Resource constraints and fiscal priorities determine the answer to the second question. And that answer is going to be the natural rate. We push around the natural rate by changing other fiscal policy. There are plenty of problems that basic income does not solve, but it can fix the way we get people their money. So we can discover the natural rate of basic income by starting the payment small and observing how the economy responds as we gradually increase the amount. Evidence such as asset bubbles, financial instability, and the existence of pro-employment policies and politics indicate that our current level of basic income is below the natural rate. To calibrate the basic income, we can watch indicators such as interest rates, labor market conditions, and economic output. Setting the basic income above its natural rate will cause inflation, but ideally we would want to calibrate it in such a way that we don't have to hit inflation first. And also inflation on its own, of course, is not an indicator that the economy has reached full output. The full technocratic process for calibrating a basic income will certainly require further research, but I imagine that it might involve a new agency kept separate from politics, much like a central bank, so they can just do this kind of technocratic algorithmic calibration. So in conclusion, there exists a hypothetical ideal world in which credit conditions are tight enough to prevent financial instability and asset bubbles, and wages merely provide an incentive for useful work. Such a world is a world with basic income at its natural rate. The natural rate of basic income allows the market to allocate resources for the maximum benefit of the people. For a given economy and a given fiscal position, there is only one natural rate of basic income. And as our productive capacity improves over time, including through automation and technological advances, we can expect that rate to increase. So that's it. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your presentation. We have some questions, and I'm not quite sure if this question is aimed towards Alex's presentation, but I'm just gonna ask them here. It's from Hans Florian Heuer. Hi, Hans Florian. We already know each other from the CCA. If the means of participation is the right that expires after participation, e.g. train ticket, then isn't the means that remains in circulation inefficient? Don't we need two types of money? Alex, maybe you go ahead.
Yeah, so there are many types of money. Like I said in the talk, money is the economy's pricing and payment standard. So there's cash, that's the thing we normally think of as money. And then there are other financial assets, some of which are issued by the government. So treasury bills, government debt, that kind of stuff. If we kind of go the debt-free sovereign money approach, then you'd have to, instead of the treasury issuing, those instruments, you'd have the central bank issuing equivalent instruments to provide the same monetary policy. But like I said at the beginning, there's two questions. There's a question of where does the economy's money come from? And then where does it go? Right? You could imagine a scenario, which I think is actually kind of pretty close to the real world, where money is being introduced into the economy, consumers are spending it, and then that money is accumulating. It doesn't just automatically circulate back to every consumer. Like there's no mechanism that causes the money to kind of spread out evenly in the economy over time. So rather than thinking of money as circulating in the economy and just kind of remaining there, I like to think of it as having a source and a destination. So money already works, I think, closer to the train ticket. I think it bounces around a few times and activates a few things, but the velocity kind of slows down and it kind of accumulates. Of course, all money, even when people save, it's invested. Sometimes maybe you're lending to the government, sometimes, which, is kind of a sink for the money to go away. But then you have the financial asset, which is a substitute for money. But what you really have to do is, if you're looking at where the money is invested and you're trying to trace it, you'll just get lost. What you have to answer is the question, how do consumers get their money? And right now, even without having to analyze any of those flows or anything, we know that the private financial sector is printing a lot of our money because the central banks are, stimulating credit expansion, right? So basic income does not solve the problem of where the money goes. It solves the problem of where the money comes from, and it can substitute for our existing mechanisms. And we can talk about, I think it's problematic for, a small number of people to accumulate, wealth, disproportionately to everyone else to extremes, right? Because then you have problems with, political power and, various things like that. But yeah, I'm only addressing the how do we fix the source of the economy's money question in this talk, not the how do we fix the kind of where the economy's money goes in the end. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, there are of course multiple sources of income that consumers currently have. As you say, there are wages, and there is credit, but there are also the unearned income streams of pensions, of welfare benefits, and of dividends. And those have grown over the last 20 to 30 years. And basic income has somehow got to fit into that income allocation. And Alex, I agree with you that its main offer is to replace increasing consumer debt. Eddie's put these questions into the stream. Hi, Eddie, about the positive feedback loop. And yes, of course. Could I just
respond quickly? I just want to mention that it's not just consumer debt, it's corporate debt, right? It's private debt in general that's providing a source of spending power to consumers. So if you're only looking at consumer debt, you're only seeing part of the picture, because a lot of people's wages are also ultimately funded by debt in the corporate sector. So I just kind of want to point that out.
Yeah,
as well.
But then we get into a long discussion really about what the circularity is of corporate debt, and whether that's just a cash pile that's sitting with companies like Apple and so on, and it's part of a blockage. Or whether it's part of the flow. And so, Eddie brings out this question as to whether consumer spending doesn't feed back into the loop into wages. Well, of course it does, but it doesn't fully. And particularly the more automation you get, the less fully that consumer expenditure will feed back into wages. And that's the basis of my analytic of the historic data, that demonstrating that labor income has not increased as much as consumer expenditure. My thesis, of course, is that is because technology has caused that. And, Keynesian economics, Keynes was fundamentally about identifying blockages that occur in the economy. So to Keynes, the economy was a plumbing system, and that plumbing system sometimes got blockages in it because effective demand didn't get, or production possibilities didn't get the signal of available aggregate demand and effective demand. So his view was fundamentally about blockages, whereas the neoclassical view, the economy is this finely tuned mechanism that responds to price signals all the time. So yeah, Eddie, I agree with you, but there are blockages there. Valentin, do you have any more questions? Or
yes, we have some more questions. I hope we can manage to answer all of them in the next 8 minutes. The next question, I just go from top to bottom, is from Richard Pereira. It said, Aida's presentation on labor, wages, and trade impacts naturally raises the question, how much potential taxation revenue for a basic income has been lost by offshoring of jobs and capital?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Well, there is a lot of that. The problem is, and the structural problem is, that we don't control globalization, right? This is a process in which everybody got in, and then therefore is something that countries don't control unless they put a capital control, which by the mainstream economics is not very well seen. So probably then we are somehow constrained in that level. And as you probably remember, in the 90s and the 2000s, it was heavily encouraged that countries offshore activities, because that was explained as an economic advantage. Countries that had cheap labor should focus on specializing tasks that demand more labor, and countries with more capital should focus on that. And this is what happened in the advanced economies. The problem is that also we have, in the advanced economies, there was a loss of jobs too. And here, this is a problem of distribution, because capital earned a lot, so there was an advantage, but that was not transmitted to people. So, I mean, it's always a trade-off, but definitely, I don't think there is a way to go out of globalization. So we need to live somehow with that.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. And there's another question. I think it might be to you, Aida. It's from Reinhard Huss. Who decides about useful and useless work? I think that it should be the citizen through a basic income allowing him to refuse useless and unethical work.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think we have seen it during COVID times, right? That the essential workers were not necessarily the highly paid, or people in the supermarkets, the liberal guys, which happens to have the lowest wages. So, I mean, certainly the way that the wages have been determined is at some level obscure, is mediated by productivity, as the economic says, but it's also, it has a level of perhaps a bargaining power, perhaps other things that we haven't really considered. Because what explains that a guy in Tesco earns less, really not much. I mean, we can argue that there are skills, we can argue that high-tech people are able to perform other jobs, but for me, it's still a debate, and actually it's a very good point that if we want to go for a different framework in the post-COVID, we need to put those questions in the debate and think more carefully within the labor market how we are setting prices, and if everything is productivity. Because the other argument that I think Jeff Crocker showed is how productivity has been rising, but wages are not. So then the story that wages are determined by productivity is not really there yet. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. I notice we've got a question from Diana Barshaw, who leads one of our other teams, to Alex. Is in your model, have you considered the impact of basic income on the price of labor?
Yeah, so yes. So this is something I think about. It's a little bit tricky for me because, like I said in the talk, it's hard to define which hours people spend are labor and which ones aren't. Right. We have kind of these legal distinctions, but those are based on kind of how we've set up the labor market and how we've defined legally what a job is and what is a job and what isn't. So the way I like to think about it is that there are 24 hours in a day. Everyone has them and they spend them one way or another. So a question we can ask is, there are a few questions we can ask. One question we can ask is in terms of the total amount of money that's paid to a person per week for work they've done, does that go up or down under basic income? I think it's going to be different for different types of jobs. I think the overall effect is that will go down. Certainly it will go down as a proportion of total consumer income, right? Because people are now getting more of their income from basic income and not income that's tied to a job. I like to say that wages are coercive, right? Wages are money that that you get that you have to do something for. So in a basic income world, lower wages are better. It's, you know, when we get more productive, when we have better technology, we can eliminate more jobs, we can eliminate more of the coercion of wages, and everybody's better off because more of their money is obligation free. So in the transition from, you know, like where we are now to basic income, I would imagine that a lot of the more desirable jobs, you'd see the wages of those jobs decrease, and then the less desirable jobs, you'd see those wages increase as workers have more freedom to choose the jobs they want and refuse the jobs they don't want.
Yeah, great, thanks. I mean, I think, you know, what we've got to do is obviously to prove and test these theoretical models, these hypotheses we're putting forward in real econometric modeling. And so, you know, that's what the two projects at Cambridge that we've initiated are seeking to do, and hopefully will report on whether our hypotheses, both Alex's and mine, stand up when they're put into a quantified, rigorous model. Valentin.
Yes, thank you very much. We have some more questions here. There is a response from Eddie Chu, which is, I would propose that there are two states, and we are in the one where stagnating wages cause stagnating spending, causing productivity growth to dominate. And thanks for your answers, Jeff. Does this... here's a follow-up. Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the productivity so-called puzzle at the moment, we need to get to what the bottom of that is, because there's no doubt that over the last 200 years, you know, technology has been implemented through automation to achieve massive increases in productivity. My first book on the philosophy of technology, I look at in the 18th and 19th centuries, the level of, you know, huge increase of productivity that was achieved, whether it's in farming or in textile production. We clothed everybody, we fed everybody. Not everybody, but in a way that we had never been able to do before. And now we've got this puzzle. And for example, how far extending retirement ages are tending to go up in various countries. Keeping people at work is artificially depressing productivity compared to what it could be if we allow people to have the retirement they deserve. And these are very open questions, but I agree with all that Ed is saying. The loop is clearly there, but to the extent to which it's getting blocked or getting diverted is the question that needs this macroeconomic modeling we're about to undertake.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think our session will last like maybe 1 more minute longer, but the 10-minute break was intentionally set, so our session can last a little bit longer. So maybe as the last round, I would guide the last question to each of you, because it's a pretty interesting one and obviously can't be answered here, but it's interesting. It's from Reinhard Huss. Why are so many mainstream economists and politicians opposed to the concept of sovereign money? It appears to address many problems in the economy. As an open question, maybe all of you.
Yeah, well, you know, if I can kick off on that, I mean, you know, I agree, Reinhard. I mean, there is this conservatism, this orthodoxy, and in all scientific areas, this is the case. I mean, Max Planck famously said that scientific theory progresses one funeral at a time, i.e., you know, as a generation who have accepted one body of scientific theory dies, then scientific theory changes. People do hold on to their prejudices or their fond theories, particularly to do with financial orthodoxy, and breaking this idea that the budget constraint that applies to a household or a company does not apply at national level, i.e. is a category error when applied to the national economy. That's taking some time to break. But let me say that in my discussions at the moment with central bankers, interestingly enough, professional frontline central bankers, they are increasingly persuaded of the concept of debt-free sovereign money. So we've got an interesting dilemma for me, certainly. My colleagues in the basic income movement, it's quite difficult to persuade them of the debt-free sovereign money argument. But for my contacts in the central banks, they're accepting debt-free sovereign money, but it's quite difficult to explain to persuade them of the basic income argument. So at some stage, if we keep persevering, we'll get there.
I'll probably just give an example on what happened in the global financial crisis, right? It's not sovereign money, but it's deficit. And many mainstream economists were opposed to that, despite the severe crisis. So I remember that the countries initially agreed with some level of deficit, then they had the summit, and then all the countries decided to go for austerity policies because there was a paper that apparently said that having debt over GDP above certain level would cause a disastrous effect. And then what happened is that many countries engage in this policy, in austerity policies, that we've seen the results, right? At least for the UK and Europe, is quite clear that the impact is been really damaging in many aspects of the economy, people, etc. So, and nowadays we face COVID, and what happened is that countries went for the deficit without thinking too much what you do. So then that makes us wonder whether we always need to believe in what is being found, because the beauty of the disasters of economics is that you can find different papers that have completely opposite results, and that makes it trickier to navigate, particularly because we are doing policies with those results. So we need to be careful on that, and I should say not always follow what everybody else says, because that might not be true.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can tell you why I've kind of gone back and forth with Jeff on this. I can tell you why I oppose the concept of sovereign money and prefer to talk about the government issuing money. And that's because, well, for two reasons. One, I think of the government issued money as a form of debt. It's an IOU from the government for goods and services. And if you try to frame it as anything else, then that just makes the analysis more complicated and makes the theory more complicated to kind of reason through. You get to the same answer either way, but it's more complicated if you try to kind of say that it's debt-free or something like that. Then the other way in which sovereign money is supposedly debt-free is the idea that the government won't be having to issue, kind of treasury securities and pay interest on them or something like that. I don't think that's right. I think if the government is not issuing sufficient treasury securities for the central bank to get to its desired monetary policy position, then the central bank has to start issuing those treasury securities. So instead of having treasury bills, you'd have Bank of England bills, right? In order to put a floor on prices in the money markets and the capital markets, right? You need a risk-free asset and a risk-free rate in order to kind of manage monetary policy. So just because if you just have the treasury, the government spending money directly into the economy without doing anything else, then all it does is changes what the central bank has to do to compensate for that. But ultimately, you end up in the same position from the perspective of the private sector. Maybe politically, there are some advantages to saying that it's not really a deficit or it's not government debt or something like that. I don't know. My preference is not to think of it as, I don't use the term sovereign money and I don't use the term debt-free to describe it. I just say the government issues money when they spend money into the economy. And that's always going to be true, regardless of whether they happen to also taxing or issuing treasury securities or something like that.
I'd probably just like to do a few comments on this MMT particularly, right? So we also need to be careful in which countries this is possible, because as the MMT said, it's only for countries that have the sovereignty, because they can issue money, right? It does not apply for countries that are externally constrained, like the emerging markets or the underdeveloped ones. So even in that, we need to be careful on which places we can implement it.
Yeah, and I also think if you call it debt-free sovereign money, then it obscures the reality that a central bank really is a bank, and they do operate as a bank and do bank things. They expand and contract their balance sheet on both sides, and they do banking operations. They're just not doing it for their own, to maximize their own profit. They're doing it to implement a particular policy. And if you say that, central bank money is not a liability of the central bank, then you start, it starts to obscure kind of the connection between central banks and commercial banks. And I really think there's more similarity there.
Well, you're putting the antithesis, of course, to my thesis, but you haven't shifted me. So I'm still going to be campaigning and analyzing in terms of debt-free sovereign money, because as I said in my presentation, I claim that we actually are already there. And as I say, I do have a number of central bankers who are saying very similar things. But, we've got a diverse group because this is an open intellectual exercise. So, people like Alex are free to argue an alternative point of view. And I hope that at some point, thesis and antithesis will produce synthesis, but one day. Okay, Valentin, I think we're through, aren't we? And you need to get into you've exhausted all of your 10-minute break.
Absolutely, Jeff. We have a 2-minute break now for the audience, and I thank you all very much for participating. And as you see, the discussion is not over yet. So if you want to join or learn more, please go to the FUBI website on the FRIBIS website. It's linked in the YouTube chat, and I hope to see you all soon.
Yes.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Yes.
And then for the audience, please just go into one of the parallel sessions afterward in 1 minute.